Hello YouTube, Dave here again. It's time to return to Cauldron. The floodwaters have subsided, the raining season has ended, and life goes back to normal, or at least as normal as it can really be in a place that has as many secrets as Cauldron does. Behind the scenes, an unknown organization is pulling the strings. Strange events are occurring. One of the most beloved nobles in all of Cauldron is, in fact, a beholder in disguise. And for the player characters, a stroll through the marketplace turns into a chaotic fight for their survival. Today we're going to be looking at the third chapter of the Shackled City Adventure Path. We're going to be taking a look at Zenith Trajectory. Alright, so here we have Zenith Trajectory. This was the third installment of the Shackled City Adventure Path, and it appeared in Dungeon Magazine issue 102 from September 2003. And what's really interesting about this is the first installment of the adventure to take place using the 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons rule set. Prior to that, chapters 1 and 2, Flood Season and Life's Bazaar, were done using 3.0. So this is the very first adventure to actually use the 3.5 D&D rule set, and of course it has the advertisings for D&D 3.5 as well. Alright, so let's get right to the adventure itself. So the adventure is designed for characters of 6th level, and by the end of the adventure they could reach, or they should reach, 8th level by its conclusion. The adventure begins with the player characters simply going about their daily business. Things have been sort of quiet over the last few weeks, and it gives the player characters a chance to sort of return back to normalcy. However, a simple stroll through the downtown markets gets interrupted when a fiendish Umber Hulk erupts from one of the warehouses and starts laying waste to the nearby buildings. The Umber Hulk is ordered to essentially smash as much stuff as possible and to cause as much destruction as possible. And this leads to probably one of the more intricate combats that this campaign has used. In this particular encounter, you've got the fiendish Umber Hulk itself. You have crowds of citizens that can be very much affected by the Umber Hulk's confusion gaze and make things difficult for the player characters. You also have several other notable NPCs, as well as the City Watch itself, attempting to deal with this creature. So a lot of stuff can happen in this particular encounter. For example, when the City Watch arrives, they fall under the effects of the Umber Hulk's confusion gaze and can either run away, attack each other. There's a lot of stuff that can potentially go wrong. While this is all going on, a petty thief by the name of Murgala decides to start looting some of the nearby businesses, and the player characters might be able to stop her from doing that if they notice her going in and robbing these things. There's also a merchant who has a fruit stand who is stubborn enough to not flee when the Umber Hulk attacks, and he needs help pushing his giant cart, which weighs like 400 pounds on wheels. Like, it's 800 pounds normally, so the player characters have to, potentially help him as well. Not that they necessarily need to, but that's somebody else that's kind of in the line of fire, and things can go pretty disastrously. And then finally, you have a seamstress by the name of Kira, who comes out as the Umber Hulk starts attacking one of the nearby buildings, and she's concerned. She has her baby with her, and unfortunately the Umber Hulk's confusion gaze causes her to set the baby down on the balcony and simply walk off. So the player characters also have a situation where that child might end up falling, and they would have to be there in order to, catch it and rescue it. So there's, like I said, a lot of stuff going on. This is a very involved combat. In addition, there's another group referred to as the MTA, or the Magical Threats Agency, that can arrive as well to assess the situation. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of things to sort of keep track of. At the end of the day, the player characters can defeat, when they defeat the Umber Hulk, they learn that It came from a warehouse owned by a merchant by the name of Mavu. And Mavu will feature heavily in the next chapter, but we don't get to interact with them in this particular installment, unfortunately. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that perhaps Mavu ended up summoning this creature, although again there's not a lot of solid evidence, but a lot of rumors end up getting spread, including the fact that, you know, people are reporting that they saw him fleeing from Cauldron riding a horse with clouds where his hoof should be, or a nightmare. So we'll learn the truth of that situation in the next installment. While things have been going on, however, something that starts to sort of become a bit of a, not, I wouldn't say an issue, but something that the player characters start to become aware of, is that after events like the slave trading ring from Life's Bazaar and the theft of the wands of control water from Flood Season, the Lord Mayor of Cauldron has started hiring on a group of half-orc mercenaries to bolster the guard. And as this adventure begins, there's some slight tensions between the the regular citizens of Cauldron, and these half-orc mercenaries. And we'll learn more about why these mercenaries have been installed in future installments. Like I said, I'm not going to spoil too much of the background story at this point. I'm going to save that for the adventure in which the player characters themselves can actually learn fully what's going on. So the player characters defeat the Umber Hulk and they become heroes once again. Their stock is really starting to rise in Cauldron itself. So much so that they actually receive an invitation by a strikingly beautiful woman who calls herself Celeste to meet at a high society club known as the Cusp of Sunset. So the Cusp of Sunset is just that. It's a nobleman's club where the characters have a chance to do all manner of things like order a fancy meal, play a game of dice, chat with nobles, and, you know, peruse the library. There's a lot of stuff that they can do here, but this is their chance to rub shoulders with high society. They also have to dress appropriately, so things like, you know, having their, like, if a ranger or, you know, characters that are more wilderness oriented would need to probably order or use special clothing provided by the establishment so that they look like they fit in. And weapons, for the most part, really aren't allowed or looked well upon, especially ranged weapons. Because, you know, as someone would be quick to point out, you know, there are no stag to hunt in the dining room. So there you go. So the whole purpose of this invitation is for the player characters to sit down and meet with a withered, ancient-looking dwarf by the name of Davked. And Davked has a request that he wants to make of the player characters. He wants the player characters to locate his son by the name of Zenith. Zenith Splinter Shield, to be precise. Zenith is a dwarven defender who led an expedition into the Underdark to try to purge it of all evil. Pretty ambitious goal, obviously, and unfortunately he hasn't been seen since, and this was quite some time ago. Davked is requesting to have Zenith return to him because Davked admits that he was a pretty terrible father, and when his wife died, she cursed him that he would wither away and become frail and useless until he makes peace with all of his children. So he's been able to make peace with 2 of his children, but Zenith is the last one that he needs to find. So using a combination of divination magics and other sources, he's been able to discover that Zenith's last known location was a Kuo-toan shrine by the name of Baal Hamuntigan. He's willing to offer the player characters 4,000 gold pieces each to begin with, or it can go up to 6,000 gold pieces worth of arms and armor from dwarven craftsmen if he's able to return Zenith. So, the fact of the matter is the player characters can obviously negotiate, they can sort of investigate, see what's going on, but the truth is that this particular Davked is not the actual Zenith Splinter Shield's father. This is a doppelganger in disguise by the name of Gorisho. And Gorisho is working for the nobleman who's actually disguised beholder by the name of Philanthro. And he's prepared his statements well, so that most of what he's saying has a fair amount of truth to it, and he took a potion of glibness, which allows him to lie, even under the effects of like Zone of Truth and things like that. So, the player characters are most likely to strike this deal. There is a bit of a catch, unfortunately. A rival group of adventurers that the player characters will start to hear more and more about as they explore Cauldron, by the name of the Stormblades, have recently collapsed all the Underdark accesses that existed in the mountain or in the volcano that is Cauldron. So there's no easy access at this point within Cauldron itself for the player characters to go into the Underdark in an attempt to find Zenith. Celeste does let them know that there is a rather eccentric hermit by the name of Crazy Jared that the player characters can speak to, because Crazy Jared seems to know something about this dwarven expedition and may have interacted with them as well. So, the next step is for the player characters to go and speak with Crazy Jared. Now, Crazy Jared is, if you've seen my video on my favorite NPCs, Crazy Jared is way, way up there in terms of my overall favorites. He was just a lot of fun to roleplay, he was a lot of fun to work with, and probably one of the most imaginative NPC characters that I've ever seen in any of these magazines. So basically, Crazy Jared is a bard who believes himself to be the king of the non-existent realm of Andoria, who is locked in an ancient battle with the demon queen of Keltos, a region, again, that doesn't actually exist. When the player characters arrive at Crazy Jared's hut, they find this, wooden hut with like a thatched roof, and it's got this makeshift wall around it that's just made of like wood and canvas, and he's got these things, at each of the corners that are designed to look like guard towers, even though they're pretty obviously not. You can see like hay sticking out through the canvas, through the gaps in the canvas and the wood. It's a very, very poor attempt to make it look like this is some important keep. As the player characters arrive, they actually see that a red dragon is currently attacking Crazy Jared. And when the battle begins, Crazy Jared runs out of his hut as this dragon starts attacking him, and sees the player characters and requests that his mighty knights slay the foul beast. Crazy Jared himself is also really fun, even during the combat, because as a bard, he uses his bardic inspiration, and it takes the form of basically doing almost like a play-by-play of everything that's happened. So if one of the characters does really well, he'll use his Inspire Greatness on him. And if one of the characters does really poorly, then he'll try to create like a sympathetic verse about, how they at least tried, even though they failed pretty spectacularly. So he was a lot of fun to work with there. Once the encounter is over, they are able to learn, although there's a lot of information about this realm of Andoria and the Demon Queen of Keltos that's thrown in there, that there is a relatively nearby access to the Underdark known as the Pit of Seven Jaws. And what the Pit of Seven Jaws is it's just basically this large pit with a set of metal grate stairs that go down. And at the bottom of the Pit of Seven Jaws, because this is how it got its name, is a seven-headed cryo-hydra that will attack as the player characters make their way down to the very first landing, using its breath weapon, using all of its other attacks. So the characters will have to overcome the cryo-hydra before they can make their way through a fissure at the bottom of the pit that will lead them down into the Underdark. Eventually, after traveling through the Underdark for a little bit of time, the characters arrive at this lake, and on the other side of this lake is the Bal Hamuntigan, the Kuo-toa shrine. The player characters have several different ways that they can try to get across, but one of the easiest ones is to simply take a ferry, which is piloted by a Kuo-toa monk by the name of Abaka. And Abaka essentially is most of the Kuo-toa here are somewhat insane. And so he'll actually offer to take the characters there, asking if they, if they seek the eye in the darkness or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrasing here. I don't have it handy, but I'm pretty sure it's something along the lines of seek the eyes in the darkness, or something along those lines. And basically, he's willing to take them to Bal Hamont again. Now, as this goes on, as he's taking the characters over, the fact of the matter is that he... Oh, sorry, there we go. Seek ye the eye in the darkness. And if they do, then he'll guide them over. As long as the player characters are actually honest about their intentions, even if they say that we are here to take Zenith back to Cauldron, Abaka doesn't actually do anything, as long as the characters aren't attempting to deceive him. If they do attempt to deceive him and he discovers it near the stairs that lead from the lake up to the shrine itself, he'll actually flip the boat over and sound an alarm, which will cause a combat to occur. But again, if they're not being dishonest, if they're, being truthful about their intentions, as long as they don't say that they're there to kill all the Kuo-toa, then he'll just simply drop them off and let them go. Bal Hamont, again, is actually a relatively small location compared to some of the previous ones that we've had throughout the Shackled City Adventure path thus far. In fact, there's only 19 rooms to explore. Most of them are just sort of utilitarian rooms, but there is this large shrine, which you see here as 5A, 5B, and 5C, depending on the floor. So at the lowest level, you're at 5C, which is at the ground level. And in this shrine, which is guarded by 4 Kuo-toa whips, which are Kuo-toa clerics, and 4 Kuo-toa warriors, there's also a large statue of the Kuo-toan god Blubdopulp. And this statue has some unique traits to it as well, which is one of, again, my more favorite things when it comes to this particular adventure. So in addition to just being a creepy statue of this sea goddess, Blubdopulp, with her lobster claws and fish face and everything else going for her, she emits a permanent widened unhallow effects that covers the entire room, which gives all the Kuo-toa +2 to AC and a +2 resistance bonus on saving throws against attacks made by good creatures. The Kuo-toa statue also, or the statue of Blubdopulp, also counts as 3 additional whips for the purposes of the Kuo-toa's lightning bolts, which, if you have a certain number of whips together, they can create this lightning bolt attack. And the more of them that are there, the more powerful the attack is. So this gives you, it almost doubles the number of whips in this particular encounter. So it can launch a fairly devastating lightning bolt. So for example, with the 4 whips, if they're working together with the statue, that's a 7d6 lightning damage, as opposed to having to only do like 1d6 per. And even a single whip can make a 4d6 lightning bolt. So if they work independently, then that's a lot of damage. So there you have it. It also summons an Erinis, which is a devil in this edition, because they kind of keep flip-flopping them around depending on which the edition is. And she's a more advanced one by the name of Ashana, and she arrives 2 minutes after the fight begins. So the characters are likely to have dealt with the Kuo-toa defenders here before this Erinis gets summoned, and that's a pretty big fight as well. And then finally, there is the High Priest, who, once the initial fight breaks out, starts casting all of his preparatory spells, has his Durgar slave help him equip his armor. So essentially, by the time the characters deal with the Erinis, then he can come out with all of his spells on him, which can make for, again, a very, very powerful fight. It's very much a battle of attrition. It's actually recommended in this adventure that the characters make repeated foyers into the dungeon. And I don't know if that's probably the right word, but basically, if they take too much damage, the expectation is that they flee, rest and recover, and then finally make their way back in. So that's probably going to happen at least once, because there's a lot of very powerful encounters. Keeping in mind, again, that the characters are probably still either 6th or 7th level at this point. Other notable encounters in this adventure is an encounter with a black dragon. So this adventure is pretty loaded with dragons. There was the red dragon by the name of Gotrod, who was attacking Crazy Jared. There's the Hydra, which is close enough. So you had, which has a cold breath, so that was fire, cold, and now in this one you have Drorlot, the Dragon Father. And Drorlot is a black dragon who's obsessed with creating half-dragons. There's actually a place earlier in the adventure where they have what are called draconic fingerlings, which are basically a half-dragon mixed with the Kuo-toa, and that's the young there. So the player characters can encounter Jorlot as well, and they can either defeat him or drive him off. And if he ends up escaping, then he might come back to haunt the player characters later on, or someone that is connected with Jorlot will probably end up confronting the player characters at some point as well. So their actions here could have long-lasting repercussions later on in the campaign. Finally, the player characters stumble upon Zenith himself, and expecting to find him in places like the prison cells that they do find I think it was a gnome or halfling sorcerer. They don't find him. Where they do find him is in this throne room where he's clutching this orb and just muttering prophecies. What basically happened is he grabbed this orb while he was in here and started seeing the future, started seeing prophecies, and the Kuo-toa start actually revering him as a seer, as a mystic. There's also much more to him than meets the eye, but that's something that we can certainly discuss at a later installment in the adventure. Zenith will, parlay with the characters for, a little bit. He is willing to talk somewhat, although all he says is that he prophesizes their doom. And also in the room is hanging upside down a group of corpses that just mutter and twitch repeatedly. They don't pose any threat in the combat, but it does make for sort of an eerie encounter where you have these bodies just spasming and moaning and groaning, and it's really, really unsettling. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I incorporated that into when I ran it a bit later on. Anyway, Zenith will battle. Eventually the fight breaks out with Zenith. He goes into his defensive stance and will fight until he's reduced to, I think, 50 hit points. Once that happens... once he reaches 20 hit points or less, he breaks out of the defensive stance and enters a teleportation circle in the middle of this room, which leads him to another part of Balhamont again, where he makes his last stand. After that, if he's reduced to 0 or close to 0, once he gets into the single-digit hit points, he simply acquiesces to the characters and becomes really just sort of silent. He'll follow them wherever they go. If a fight breaks out, and he's able to, he'll attack whoever comes near him, but he won't actively act aggressively against the player characters directly. So the characters effectively can take this broken dwarf back to Cauldron. When they arrive, Davket is no longer available, but in this version of the adventure, Celeste offers to pay them whatever was agreed upon at the beginning of the adventure, and at that point, that concludes this particular chapter. So just sort of a bit of a recap. It starts off with the characters fighting this Umber Hulk that's attacking the town itself. The Umber Hulk is implied to have been unleashed by a merchant by the name of Mavu, who we'll learn more about in the next installment. The characters are then invited to a high society club where they are given a task to retrieve a dwarf by the name of Zenith Splinter Shield. The individual sending them on this quest is actually a doppelganger, who is doing it for reasons that aren't clear at this point in time to the player characters. However, will factor in very heavily at the later stages of the campaign. And again, I'll save that sort of reveal for when we get there. And finally, the characters, encounter a crazy old man out in the middle of the wilderness, who can send them towards an entrance to the Underdark, where they battle a cryohydra and fight their way through a Kuo-toan shrine to recover this dwarf who, instead of being a prisoner like everyone would have expected, actually became sort of almost a spiritual leader of the Kuo-toa. An individual who fights adamantly until near death, and then he simply just becomes docile and will make his way back without really uttering a word other than the odd prophecy. And that's Zenith Trajectory. So that's everything that happens in the adventure. So now we'll move on to my closing thoughts. Alright, so that was Zenith Trajectory. This is the Dungeon Magazine version. Now, when I ran the Shackled City campaign path, I actually used the hardcover. And I don't want to talk too much about the hardcover now, because that'll be the subject of its whole other separate video. But I will say that Zenith Trajectory is probably the first of the adventures that were in the magazine that got pretty interestingly changed to make the storyline a little bit tighter. For example, in the hardcover, the player characters actually get to interact with Oribus Philanthro at the cusp of sunrise. That's the High Society Club. He wants to greet the characters personally. Now, Oribus Philanthro is actually the beholder that the characters encountered near the end of Life's Bazaar, who was the one that came back or appeared suddenly and demanded that one of the children in particular be returned to Cauldron. Now, the player characters are unlikely at this point in time to learn that he is actually a beholder, and this led to one of my favorite moments when I ran this campaign personally. And I know I said Flood Season was one of my favorite adventures for the fact that it's just something off to the side that still makes the characters feel like heroes. As far as adventures that are really strongly connected to the main story, this was probably one of my favorite ones. I actually ran this adventure for 2 separate groups, although I had a couple of players carry over from one to the other. Just life events kind of made it difficult to continue running with the first group, and what ended up happening was they got into the Kuo-toa Shrine, and the last fight that they had actually went pretty poorly, with one of the characters dying, and then just the adventure kind of was put on hiatus for a while. Eventually I started it back up with a secondary group. Now this secondary group actually got to meet Philanthro. And I didn't use the name Oribus just because Oribus has, pretty similar connotations to the word orb, which might be a little bit too on the nose when it comes to his identity. So I kind of took his name and split it into 2. He would be referred to as Oribus when he's the beholder, and Philanthro when he's disguised as this elven noble. So the player characters actually got to meet him and interact with him when I ran the chapter, or this version of it from the hardcover. And the characters at first were kind of suspicious of Philanthro. They made one sense motive check that they did pretty poorly on, and for some odd reason they just trusted him blindly throughout the rest of the campaign. He became a very close confidant for the party, which was perfect for Philanthro, because as this beholder who is working with this mysterious organization that we know very little about at this point in time, if anything, he can just basically pull the player character strings and he leads them along. And this was one of those adventures where the characters, what they do actually really strongly benefits these villains that are operating behind the scenes, and we'll talk more about them later on. So when I ran this for my original group, they did get to Balhamuntigan, where they were, again, we had to take that break. So when the new group came in, what they actually ended up discovering was that the bodies of the original party were hanging up in the ceiling, the twitching and the moaning and stuff like that. So for the 2 players who were in the original, were part of the original group, it was a cool callback for them to have seen the bodies of their other characters there. Just as a way, again, I couldn't really do much. I didn't, they didn't have their original character sheets. I knew what they were, but they didn't have their original sheets. So at that point, it's like you just gotta basically make new characters. I did have an NPC that was with them who I did say managed to escape, and he ended up taking over the Malachite Fortress and became another source of information for the player characters. So overall, my thoughts on Zenith Trajectory: this is an absolutely excellent installment of the campaign. Overall, this, and I know I said this about Flood Season, but this is one of, my absolute favorite chapters of the entire series, and it's a really, really good campaign path. I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but it's a very excellent story, and this is one of the better installments. The fight with the Umber Hulk is very chaotic and involved, but it is fleshed out in a way in the pages here that make it very easy to work with. For example, not everyone starts off the combat, from round 1. So, in subsequent rounds, you start adding more levels of complexity, but their tactics are all spelled out. So as long as you can stick to that as best as possible, then things are going to be fine. But it makes for a very, very chaotic fight. You've got things going on all around you, and the characters have to determine if saving, these individuals in the town is more important than immediately battling the Umber Hulk. So there's all these different distractions that they have to go through. The Cusp of Sunrise was again just a kind of a cool scenario that they enjoyed playing through. There was some gambling that the player characters did. They enjoyed speaking with the nobles, and it was just sort of a great opportunity to just do some role playing, and it was a very, very fun section. The negotiations with Davkid, were another interesting part. And what was interesting, because he was offering the characters so much money, in my group they didn't actually question him at all. They just, were inclined to believe everything that he said, which was really interesting, because obviously we know that that was also a deception. And of course, the fight with Crazy Jared is probably the coolest NPC that I've ever seen in any of these published adventures. I love him to death, and I used this exact encounter again in a different campaign, and got the same reaction out of the players. They just absolutely loved it. The one player who was in the Shackled City path who just absolutely lost it when it came to Crazy Jared did so again, and it was just such a fun moment, and there was a lot of great stuff in there. This adventure is a little loaded with dragon enemies. Like I said, there's the red dragon, there's the cryo hydra, and then there's the black dragon. So there's 2 actual true dragons, plus the fight with the Hydra. So there's 3 different types of breath weapons being used against the player characters in this adventure. So it's a little bit loaded that way, and I don't know of too many other chapters of any of the adventure paths that have that many different types of draconic enemies that the player characters are going up against. The reveal that Zenith is actually a prophet of the Kuo-toa was a really cool moment, and something that the characters really weren't expecting, and it added an air of mystery to it. It's something that the characters were very much interested in, and using him to utter prophecies during the fight, which he certainly can do, is again another really great moment. It's a little bit better done in the hardcover, because the hardcover gives prophecies that actually relate directly to the storyline, whereas these ones are a little bit more vague because of the fact that they wanted all the chapters to be able to stand on their own individually. So, at the end of the day, this is an excellent addition to the Shackled City adventure path, one of the better chapters in a really good campaign to begin with. And if you're looking to, even if you just want to run a standalone adventure, there's a lot of really cool stuff in this one if you get the opportunity. So I highly recommend it. It's, again, one of my all-time favorites. So, there you go. That was Chapter 3 of the Shackled City campaign path. I hope you enjoyed the series so far. Still got quite a ways to go. I'm going to be doing 2 of these videos a week. I think is going to be the formula for this going forward until we finish it off. And for anyone who was wondering, I do plan on moving on to Age of Worms and then finally Savage Tide after that, to cover all 3 of the Dungeon Magazine D&D adventure paths. So again, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time. Funding for this channel is provided by my awesome supporters over on Patreon. So everyone who has donated to that, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. Even $1 a month helps immensely, and without your guys' support, this channel would not be possible. I want to provide special thanks to Kennedy S., David L., Will W., Michael L., The Twisted Tentacle Inn, and Roll Stats for their generous donations. Thank you again to everyone who's contributed, and all of you make this possible.